In 1987, two women were killed in the English town of Royal Turnbridge Wells. 20-year-old Caroline Pierce and 25-year-old Wendy Nell. They were both sexually assaulted and strangled to death after an unidentified assailant broke into their homes. The attacks were seemingly random, and investigators found themselves at a dead end. Eventually, the case seemed to go cold. As forensic technology becomes better, faster, and cheaper, this story becomes more and more common. DNA provides a link to cases that went cold decades ago, providing justice that the victim's family had long since given up on. In the case of the Kent Bedsit murders, the DNA profile of the killer was officially created in 2007, confirming what the detectives on the case had always believed. Whoever the killer was, the same man was responsible for both crimes. Law enforcement now had a DNA profile, but they were only able to compare it to the samples of DNA that they already had in their system. If the killer didn't have a recent criminal record, there was no way to find a match. Year by year, DNA technology became more and more useful, and finally, in 2019, the Bedsit murders case was reviewed and the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was reanalyzed. Forensic experts used familial DNA technology to identify people who were possibly related to the killer, and people across the country were sent to visit all of these potential relatives, hoping that they would give consent to giving a DNA sample. One of the people whose door the police knocked on was a man named David Fuller. Interestingly, David did have a criminal record. As a young man in the early 70s, he carried out a string of burglaries, where he entered houses by climbing through the windows. A sample of David's DNA was collected, and along with the rest of the samples, it was compared to the DNA profile of the Bedsit murderer. Unlike the rest of the DNA samples, David Fuller's was an exact match to the killer. This was the indisputable proof that the police needed to arrest David, and on the 3rd of December, the perpetrator of the Bedsit murders was finally behind bars. But when investigators began to search David's home, they realized how he had spent the years since he committed the murders, and that he was even more sick and twisted than they thought. As soon as David was arrested, a highly trained search team was deployed to comb through his home. They were looking for any evidence that linked him to the Bedsit murders, as well as any sign that he'd committed any further crimes. The more hidden the evidence was, the more the search team were interested in finding it. And by far, the thing that David had gone to the most lengths to hide was the box of hard drives that had been carefully hidden in the back of the chest of drawers in his wardrobe. Shortly after the Bedsit murders, David had gotten a job working maintenance at the Kent and Sussex Hospital and worked there for more than 20 years. Afterward, he switched to another hospital, Pembury, where he worked as a maintenance supervisor. These jobs gave him a swipe card that allowed him to access the hospital's highly secure areas. And, in particular, it allowed him unsupervised, uncontrolled access to the mortuary. On those hidden hard drives, David kept an obsessive, meticulous record of the main crime he had spent his life committing: necrophilia. Most of David's victims had not been killed by him, like the Bedsit murders. Instead, he had memorized the visual fields of the CCTV cameras in the hospital. He used the blind spots in the camera's footage to sneak into the mortuary after hours and sexually abuse the corpses of girls and women. He had used his digital camera to film footage of himself abusing a disturbing amount of dead human bodies. A total of 101 victims were confirmed, although authorities suspected that David had committed necrophilia many more times than that. After he returned home from work, David would then carefully transfer the footage onto the hard drives, which he kept hidden in the back of his wardrobe. The earliest footage that investigators found was dated back to 2005. The most recent offense had taken place less than a week before he was arrested. David had organized the necrophilia footage by researching the name and age of every victim, even searching social media to find the accounts of the corpses that he abused. David only abused female corpses, but apart from that, he didn't seem to have a particular victim profile. The oldest that he committed necrophilia with had died at the age of 100. The youngest corpse was a little girl who had only been 9 years old when she passed away. When David abused the corpses, he showed no signs of remorse or respect for them or their grieving loved ones. He committed this act whenever he could, often molesting the corpses very soon after their passing or just before their family arrived for a viewing. Police had thought that they had finally apprehended the perpetrator of the Bedsit murders, bringing justice to the families of Caroline Pierce and Wendy Nell. In reality, their investigation into the largest-scale necrophilia case in the country's history was only just beginning. On each of the hard drives, there were more than 500 videos, as well as 800,000 pictures. And that didn't include the other evidence that was later found on floppy disks, CDs, film negatives, and mobile phones. 9 dedicated investigators spent a grueling 5 months combing through the physical property they seized from David's home. It took 6 police officers more than a year to process the digital evidence, file by file, in an effort to figure out how many crimes David had committed and who the victims had been. While going through the footage, they realized that David had a habit of returning to the same corpse several times to commit more disgusting acts. In October 2021, David Fuller pleaded guilty to 51 criminal offenses. At his trial, the daughter of one of David's victims spoke to him directly, telling him that when she was told about her mother's corpse being abused, the pain and emotional upset seared through her body like a knife. She addressed him by name, saying, quote, "David, I want you to know how much damage you have caused, how your sick and twisted behavior has damaged families like mine. I'm pleased that you're now being held accountable for what you did, only 7 hours after she died." David's necrophilia victims were not named in court, but the prosecution and families of the victims told the courtroom about the lives of the women that he had molested in death. They had been skiers, nurses, teachers, pilots, World War II veterans, happily married wives, mothers, and grandmothers. They had been daughters, sisters, and friends. In their last moments, many of them had wanted to continue living. At least 3 of the victims had been children who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. Instead, their lives had been cut short, and their bodies had been defiled shortly after their deaths. At the time David committed these acts on some of the victims, they still had defibrillator pads attached or IV lines inserted, from where the hospital staff had tried and failed to save their lives. David was found guilty of both the Bedsit murders and the necrophilia charges, and sentenced to life in prison. A detective for the Kent police commented on the verdict, saying that it would mean little to this abhorrent behavior, who, throughout our investigation, had demonstrated no remorse and only a capacity for self-pity. There was no way to make David understand the gravity of what he had done. There was no way to rehabilitate a man who had committed at least 2 murders and then brazenly violated corpses for years without remorse. The only thing that the judge could do was ensure that David never harmed another person, living or dead. During David's sentencing, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told him, quote, "You are 68 years old. In 1973 and 1976, you were convicted of dozens of burglaries, committed by climbing into homes through windows. You spent the subsequent years living a lie, the facade of a mild and ordinary life, while in seclusion, you committed revolting and outrageous acts of the deepest darkness. You have a family who you deceived over all those years. It's almost impossible to believe that a single man can cause the misery to so many that you have done. But you did it, and in consequence, you are paying the price that human justice can be exact. The rest of your mortal life in prison." That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for listening to this episode today. If you're brand new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, welcome. Super happy that you're here. And I just assumed that someone told you about the podcast. It's kind of like the opposite of the Fight Club, where with this podcast, please tell other people about it. I don't want you to keep it a secret. Tell everyone about 10 Minute Murder. And rule number 2, tell everyone about 10 Minute Murder. And BT Dubs, if you are a new listener to 10 Minute Murder, hit subscribe wherever you are listening right now. First of all, it helps you more easily catch up on all the back episodes of 10 Minute Murder. You might get a couple episodes in and say, I've got some things to do. I can't listen to podcasts while I do them. So then later on, you're like, I'd like to listen to more of that podcast. So you open the app back up and you're like, well, what the heck was the name of it? If you subscribe, you don't have to remember that all the time. You don't have to search for it every single time. And also what it does when you subscribe is, I can't confirm this, but I think it helps the algorithm in some ways. The computer people are like, hey, there's a lot of people subscribing to this podcast. We should probably make it be in front of even more people. And who knows how those algorithms work? I just assume that they're behind everything. And hey, connect with me on social media to see the pictures of what we talk about here in the podcast. And don't worry, I don't post crime scene photos. And it's not gross and it's not graphic. Because I don't know about you, but I know that when I listen to podcasts and the host starts talking about a person, I want to know what they look like. It's kind of the same way that when you're in traffic and someone cuts you off and you're like, I need to speed up and figure out what this fool looks like. I want to look them in the face, see if they look like a traffic cutter offer. It's kind of that same thing, I think. But on social media, you can follow 10 Minute Murder and I post the pictures of what these people look like. Links for all that are in the show notes of this episode, or you can just search for 10 Minute Murder. And if you like this episode, leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, any place that's possible, and let your friends know about 10 Minute Murder. And quickly before we end this episode, I posted a poll over the holiday weekend on Instagram. I was conflicted somewhat. I spent an entire day creating a new logo for a brand new podcast where I would do longer episodes. I think the logo looks great. And I was about to run with it until I thought, what if this isn't what people want? What if I just added a third episode per week to 10 Minute Murder consistently? I do it sometimes, but what if I did that more consistently? You're always going to get the 2, but what if you got a third one? What would people prefer? A brand new podcast where I still did 10 Minute Murder, but then I did longer episodes on this other podcast? Or would they like for me to just add an episode to the current one? So I posted the poll and people overwhelmingly said to do a third episode per week, even after I spent an entire day creating this logo. But, this show would not work without you and your opinions. And this is all hypothetical when I get more time to start doing this. I don't know if you know this, but it takes time and effort and planning and money to make this podcast. But I would like to expand it, so adding a third episode does make more sense. I'm not going to completely say that I'm never going to do another podcast altogether. In addition to this one, where I do longer episodes, I will 100% do that at some point because I've already made the logo for it. But priority will be adding a third episode per week to 10 Minute Murder. Okay? And now we are all up to date. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder. See you soon.